Despite having a mandate from the people who elected me democratically, today I feel that continuing in this position presents insurmountable difficulties. I announce to you today that I'll be resigning as governor, effective Friday, 2nd of August.
Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Greg Wilpert in Baltimore. What you just saw was Puerto Rico's Governor Ricardo Rosselló announcing his resignation following almost 2 weeks of massive protests that mobilized hundreds of thousands of Puerto Ricans. Rosselló had made the announcement shortly before midnight on Wednesday. The movement against him had gathered momentum after the Puerto Rican Center for Investigative Journalism published a series of text messages that Rosselló exchanged with his inner circle, in which they made disparaging, homophobic, and sexist comments against fellow Puerto Ricans. But those messages were only the latest scandal involving the governor. Corruption allegations and mismanagement had already been plaguing his tenure for weeks before that. Here's what some of the protesters had to say after Rosselló made his resignation announcement.
It's a bit late, but he finally did it. We're celebrating. We're super happy. The people can do it when they unite.
After my son's birth, this is the happiest moment of my life. This is incredible. I've been waiting for this moment since I'm a little kid with my father.
This is a victory for the poor, for the Maria victims. This is a victory for everyone that has been let down by the government. Ricardo Rosselló, goodbye.
We are people of dignity, and our government took it away from us until tonight.
Joining me now to discuss the current situation in Puerto Rico is José Caraballo-Cueto. He is an economist and associate professor of statistics and finance at the University of Puerto Rico in Cayey. Thanks, José, for joining us today.
Thanks for the invitation.
So let's start with your impressions of what the protesters had achieved, Rosselló's resignation. How significant is this, and what does it mean for Puerto Rico now?
Well, I think it's a landmark that for the first time in our history, and perhaps for the first time in many parts of the world, especially in Latin America, a pacific protest removed an elected governor out of power. So I think that's a great achievement. I think that's a landmark, actually, in our history. And I think that it's going to bring some stability because he was a distraction. He was bringing instability to our institutions, and we need secure institutions in order to perform the economic policies that we need. So I think that was a good achievement last night, and I look forward to the next steps that we need in order to reach a stability.
Now, Puerto Rico's Secretary of Justice, Wanda Vázquez, is assumed to take over for Rosselló once he's gone on August 2nd. Now, will her taking over change anything, and will there be early elections for governor, or will she remain for the rest of Rosselló's term, which actually doesn't end until January 2021?
Well, that's the second step that we have to make sure we make it well. The Constitution of Puerto Rico says that the person that should take the power in case of the government resignation is the Secretary of State, but he resigned 2 weeks ago. So the third person should be the Secretary of Justice. But just today we have another leak with another chat that involved that Secretary of Justice, and I'm not sure that that person is going to bring the stability that we need. My suggestion is that all the parties involved, especially all the sectors and all the political parties, look for a person of consensus that can actually get us to the next year, and elections are going to be held on next year. So I know there are many people that can do that transition, but we have to make sure that we look for them.
Now, one of the issues that Puerto Rico has been struggling with for a long time is its status as a U.S. territory, which really should be called a colony since it's part of the U.S. but has no power in the federal government. Now, do you think that this protest movement and the governor's resignation will advance the cause for democracy in Puerto Rico? How do you see that development playing out now after his resignation?
Well, there are two sides of the coins right now. There is on the one side, the people of Puerto Rico are in the streets for the first time in a long time. They are demanding more democracy. They want to clean the house. They want zero corruption in the government, and they are demanding the board that was imposed by Congress 3 years ago to go as well with Rosselló. On the other side, there is the federal government, and they're watching everything that is happening in Puerto Rico, the federal government of the U.S., and they are somehow, some newspapers, such as the New York Times and the Washington Post, are also demanding to give more power to this fiscal control board so that they make sure that they take the control of everything in Puerto Rico, especially all the political institutions, to make sure that the policies that they want to execute can take place. So I think those two sides of the coins are going to be struggling in the next week, and I hope that this side of the coin, that is the people of Puerto Rico and their demands, are the ones that are finally accomplished.
Now, related, of course, to the political situation, and you already touched on it, and perhaps even more complicated, is the issue of Puerto Rico's economy. Now, how do you see Puerto Rico's economic future? Following the Promesa Act of 2016 and a near default on its debt, it now has this Financial Oversight Management Board that you mentioned, which is not controlled really by Puerto Ricans, but by the U.S. government. What does this mean for Puerto Rico? And is there any chance that people will now, after this victory of forcing the governor's resignation, that they will mobilize against this state of affairs now that they've achieved this resignation?
Yes, I think these protests are going to affect the plan of adjustment that the board was planned to present to the court in these days. The plan of adjustment of the central government, it has the agreement of all the debts that the central government had. And both Rosselló and the Fiscal Control Board have certain agreements on how to present that plan of adjustment to the judge. So right now, those plans we'll have to wait a little longer until this new government is in office, and we have to see what are their orientation. So I hope that at the end, the people of Puerto Rico win with this, and that we can look for better debt agreements than the one that the previous government reached with the creditors, especially with bondholders.
Tell us a little bit more about the adjustment plan that you mentioned. I mean, what would it mean if it were implemented? And, you know, this is something we've covered before with Mark Weisbrot, for example, of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. But I just want to get your take on what this adjustment plan would mean if it were to be implemented for Puerto Rico.
Well, the one that the board was thinking to implement, along with the Rosselló administration, it includes pension cuts. It includes I think, too generous agreement with bondholders, and they don't actually want to look at the debt that was illegal vis-a-vis the legal part of the debt. They, of course, they made some statements in the press that there are some debts that are going to be legal, but they at the same time they are negotiating with those bondholders. So I think we have to make sure that we don't negotiate any illegal debt. And the second thing that we need to make sure is that we find sustainable payments, so that in 3 or 4 years we are not in another round of restructuring. And I'm not sure that giving generous agreement with bondholders are going to prevent that.
And what about the possibility of a debt forgiveness? I mean, that has been mentioned by some people, but obviously the federal government is not willing to support that. But don't you think that that might be a route that the movement that has, so to speak, developed now could be pushing for?
We have to see how that movement developed. I have seen in other countries, such as Haiti, after the earthquake, a large part of the debt was forgiven. But in the case of Puerto Rico, after the Hurricane Maria, what the board did was to double the payments in the fiscal plan, the debt payments. So if we compare, as I did, the fiscal plan before Maria with the fiscal plan after Maria, what the board did was to double the payments, because they're saying, well, the government of Puerto Rico is going to have more money now because we're going to observe a relatively large reconstruction, and that is going to increase government revenue. So let's use those new government revenues to pay more debt. And for me, that's ridiculous, because after a disaster, you cannot pay more debt than the one that you planned before the disaster. So I hope that the new governor that is going to be in power in the next month make a new fiscal plan and negotiate new terms with the board, and they actually stick to the debt payments that they say that were sustainable before Maria. If not, they're going to use Hurricane Maria as an excuse to bail out bondholders.
Okay. Well, we're going to leave it there for now, but of course, we're going to continue to follow the situation in Puerto Rico. I was speaking to José Caraballo-Cueto, economist and associate professor at the University of Puerto Rico. Thanks again, José, for having joined us today.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining the Real News Network.
Hey everyone, my name is Arud Sheikh, and I'm the Development Campaign Manager at the Real News Network. If we're going to stand up to the corporate elites, then we need your help to make people-powered media. And that's why I'm asking you to please donate to the Real News Network. And while you're at it, hit the subscribe button. Thanks so much.